Uh, okay, cool. Well, I guess we can jump into Halogen if that's okay with you. Like we have the
Yeah.
Halogen section next because that seemed like a big part of what you did and what you're still doing,
Yes.
right? So yeah, let's talk about Halogen. So I have a question for you actually before we begin, and this is
Yeah.
I just thought of this, so hopefully you won't. So how would you describe Halogen to somebody who doesn't know Halogen at all?
Mm. I guess it depends on what their background is. The
Mm-hmm.
main way that I describe Halogen is to people who already have front end experience, and
Mm-hmm.
there's anybody who's working in front end, it's kind of unavoidable to come across React at some
Mm-hmm.
point.
Mm-hmm.
And I would basically describe Halogen as pure script, like 100% pure script answer to React. A lot of the ideas are quite similar between the two. There are some pretty serious differences as well. But the closest analog to Halogen would be React, like component architecture, isolating logic into these like bundles of state and
Mm-hmm.
logic and behavior in these components, and using those to build up an application. And so much of the structure of Halogen applications end up becoming similar to React ones because of that core like component architecture idea. Although you can
Okay.
do things like Elm architecture in Halogen. But if you've got the components, you might as well use them.
Cool,
But
interesting.
that's my like short version
Okay,
of Halogen. But
a
anything
very
more, I feel like
strongly
comes down
typed
to their
version of
background.
React, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love Halogen. Halogen's the first. It's the first front end anything I did. I mean, I was learning JavaScript initially, but not front
Mm-hmm.
end, and so I was learning front end, and I was learning PureScript, and I was learning Halogen all at the same time. And that's what my first Java CitizenNet was. They've got a big Halogen application that replaced an Angular app, and yeah, Halogen is like it's got those analogs to React, those parallels, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you get to basically unleash the full force of all your FP knowledge as much as you would like completely. And that's really cool. It can maybe cause you to nerd out a little bit too much, but it's really cool. And the other thing that goes along with that is being in PureScript and being like doing everything the PureScript way means that you don't have to be so careful as you do using something like PureScript React
Mm-hmm.
about like referential stuff and making sure that you've got like stable references to your data so that React doesn't go crazy re-rendering over and over.
Okay,
In Halogen, you kind of just get to do things the PureScript way and not worry about it,
just
which is
follow
a
the
big
types
relief.
because yeah, they're offering
Yeah.
all the safety you need, right?
Yeah, and so you got all the stuff that Halogen gives you, and then on top
Mm-hmm.
of it, you can build or import from elsewhere your own application monad that very cleanly lets you build up all the capabilities that you want to be able to use in your app, and it just lets you build it's just a delightful way to build applications that I have not personally experienced elsewhere.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's my pitch. Buy Halogen.
By Halogen, yeah, definitely agree with that. By Halogen. Okay, cool. So I guess since you mentioned Citizen.net, I guess that's where you worked on Formless, right?
Yeah. I got so that
That's
was my
where the
first
project
job.
started.
I
Yeah.
was recruited straight out of the PureScript Slack by Dave Zuck and the team at CitizenNet. And yeah, they were just getting started. They'd all self-taught PureScript over the last couple of months. They'd had a lot of trouble with this Angular application. Just the velocity was just slowing down, just addressing issues that were constantly cropping up. And so they wanted to try something typed, and they chose PureScript and they chose Halogen. And so we all kind of it was actually really a wonderful journey because all of us were sort of new to this. Like nobody had like
The
they were
answers.
very experienced developers, but
Okay.
for PureScript and definitely Halogen was quite new. And so we were all kind of in the Wild West. Like, how do you do this effectively? How do you build like a whole app like this? And we made a few mistakes along the way, but one of the things that helped us out a bunch early on was actually yours. It was your Halogen template
Okay.
that you made, if you remember that.
Oh yeah, I remember that you
Yeah.
actually had a PR to that because.
Yeah, we basically cribbed it from you, and then
Okay. Well, I mean,
I started
before
working
giving
on
me
top
too
of
much
that.
praise on that, I stole that from the what was it called? Slam Data, like the big app. Like it was just a huge simplification of how the Slam Data
Yeah,
repository was created. And I was actually in the exact same position as you were. I was a team lead on a company doing Angular, so I was trying to move from Angular to PureScript. So very
yeah,
similar. Okay, cool.
yeah, great. And in to a degree, all roads sort of lead back to Nathan, who
Hmm.
had a huge hand in that Slam Data
Hmm.
application.
Yeah.
Um, and then who, as I was implementing your version of it with the template, I was basically every single day like, how does this work? Like, how do you do this? How do you design things? How do you do things? And he in particular was just so active at answering those questions. So he was kind of like our shadow, fifth teammate in a way. So to both of you, a big thanks. I mean, that was enormously helpful. And that ended up becoming the foundation of RealWorld Halogen, was basically an extension of that same learning path.
Hmm.
And my desire to make sure that it could be available to more people with some explanation.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, that was one of the first not projects, but first contributions I feel I've made to the PureScript community. And I have to say that since it was so well received, at the very least by well, the whole community, but also by you, you also like, you commented, you contributed a couple of PRs, we had conversations. That made me feel pretty good because that was a first for me, right? I didn't really contribute to open source much when I was doing C# and JavaScript and so on, right? So
Yeah.
I think that might have been also like very good for me, right? That I had people being, oh, cool, this is nice, right? And help me do more, right? Or continue doing that.
It's such a beautiful thing about the size of the PureScript community. And I feel like the size of the PureScript community is often treated almost as a negative, as it's not big enough to have like a flagship, industry leading library for every use case. So, that's, if only we had more people and we could have more of that like sort of thing. But a really cool part of PureScript is that we got to know each other, and we got to know so many like core team members are always in the Slack, and you can there's these open invitations. You can just reach out to them and you can talk, and they're involved, and you're doing these streams. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about this community. And it's like a character that I hope, as it continues to grow, as it has been growing, that we're able to preserve pretty well.
Yeah, definitely.
It's definitely like, it's probably, as much as I love writing PureScript, I really think that it's those sorts of connections and participating in the community is the main reason that I've stayed so focused on it and continued with it. It's really rewarding outside of the technical anything in that sense as well. And if you mix in the technical reward as well, and then like all that philosophy, intellectual stuff too, I mean, how could you not just end up spending way too many of your Saturdays doing your programming stuff?
Oh yeah, I definitely resonate with that, right? Because like I had a similar journey to yours in the sense that I also learned using the Haskell book. But
Yeah.
while I was doing that, so I didn't join the RC channel. I joined the FP Slack from the beginning, and then I was on both the Haskell and the PureScript channels. And as I was like, just by watching those channels, I was terrified to ask questions in the Haskell channels. So I was reading the Haskell book, and I was asking the questions on the PureScript channel, and I was like, not specifying that I'm doing Haskell, just this should probably be the same in PureScript, right? So let me just ask there, because it feels way friendlier. Like the people seem to be like, so that that's.
Yeah, I think that PureScript's done, and it may be the hybrid of like the beginner friendliness of JavaScript. It's something I really do admire about JavaScript. Tech has had kind of at least from me as more of an outsider than someone who's been in tech for a long time, had kind of a reputation for unfriendliness. And and Haskell especially had, not for unfriendliness, but for like elitism sort of reputation. But when I really started participating in a community, the first one that I really participated in was PureScript, and it just found so much more of that like friendliness from JavaScript and very little of the technical elitism or anything.
Yeah, and there's definitely
there's some in any community, but
but I mean, there's definitely a lot of Galaxy Brain people doing PureScript, right? But they don't feel like they're showing it off, or maybe they're just like recommending new people to do. Like, for example, I was going through the Reddit Haskell, like I think last Friday or something, or maybe it was even this Friday. And there's this person posting a post there saying, "Hey, I'm new to Haskell. What should I be working on?" And I'm not kidding. The second replied. So the first one was reasonable. The second one was build a compiler, and they're talking about how to do LLVM and like build. And I'm like, how do you do that, right?
Yeah.
Like, sure, like
Come
Haskell's
on.
good for interpreters, but like tell him to do a calculator or something, right? If you want to do interpreter, right?
Yeah.
Don't go to LLVM compiler crazy, like, yeah.
Yeah. It's you mentioned that like PureScript's got plenty of like galaxy brain people, but you don't like notice it so much. And I feel like that's just such so true across PureScript. Like so often you'll be talking with somebody and you'll be like chatting about something simple and they'll be like, oh, actually, I think I might know the solution. And they'll show you something and you're like, you just wrote this right now? Like you just sort of typed that out? Like it's like a week's worth of me like puzzling if I could ever get there. Like, and there's more so when I was like first joining in when things seem so magical, but there's just so much of that and people are so humble. I really, really love that and appreciate that about the community.
Oh yeah, especially like people like Nate or even Nicholas, who's like a very, very young college student, and like, oh, that's just like, and he doesn't even say just, right. He's not even diminishing the like he'll just type an answer that's incredibly well thought out and like very the community is just awesome. I love this community.
Yeah, I'm sure we could sing praises for much longer.
Anyway, so let's continue. So let's see, because we have some things in chat. So, okay, so Gil Christian is asking, as a Halogen app grows, would it differ too much from the real world one? That's a good question.
I don't think so. You might start to subdivide things a bit more. You might like break down your state a little bit more, or you might end up having to take a different approach maybe to the APIs. Instead of like handwriting everything, you might start getting into like code gen for that. But that's basic structure is the same that is used. That's still the one in CitizenNet, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of lines of code that is now, but that's the basic architecture. It still scales pretty well.
Okay. Yeah, I bet that's a good thing to hear. And then Gil Christian also said the real world Halogen app is very comprehensive and useful. Yep, definitely. Oh, and Nicholas is in chat and still says that it feels we are getting called out this nicely. Well, I mean,
you joined at the perfect moment. We've been talking about you for the whole hour so far.
Cool. So let's see. That's okay. So we're going about Formless. So you started working on Formless while you were at CitizenNet, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So was that to like fix or to cut, like it was something that you needed at work, or is it just okay, this would be cool to do?
Yeah, it was definitely something we needed at work. The first library that we worked on at CitizenNet, who were very focused on, how can we were just really enjoying using the language and using Halogen. We wanted to make sure if we could that we give back. And so we wrote an autocomplete component, and we made it so it didn't do any rendering for you, so it would be suitable as an open source component. This is when like render props in React was starting to get big, and we called that one like a renderless component. Kind of a good time for Nicholas to join because he had a big hand in in getting that to actually work in the first place. And after that component, we started using it throughout the application, and the app has a lot of really big, complex forms. And in Halogen, without any helpers, same is true of Elm, same is true of React or anything. Without any helpers, forms can just become unmanageable and just so filled with boilerplate. Especially if you say in Halogen, for example, if you have like an action for every interaction with a field that you have in a form, it just gets out of control right away. And so Formless was we did like a 50 input form with like dependencies and all this stuff, and like we just got so bogged down. I mean, this was like turning into a several thousand line like monstrosity, and we're like, there's got to be like a different way to do this. And the idea for Formless came initially out of that like renderless component experience with Select, which is the autocomplete, but also conversations with Paula actually around like validation and he'd been working on like Polyform, and so he and I actually spent quite a bit of time like, how do you write like a type for a form, and then you have all these other types that have to come out of that, like a form input versus a form's output versus its like validation error, and you're chaining those together, and it just gets like so complicated so quickly. Anybody who says that forms are easy, like I want to learn from you then, because forms are just they like seem so simple at the outset, but they end up being so difficult. And yeah, so Formless was just like a month-long, like desperate fight against boilerplate in forms. And it ends up, I mean, it's not without its boilerplate now. Formless is far from a perfect library in that regard, but it does help cut down on a lot of that effort with writing the forms. So anyways, that was such an incredibly long answer to your question, but that's kind of the, like, Formless was just like, there's so much boilerplate. How do we deal with it? And if you look at the implementation, it turns out it's not very easy to do so.
Yeah, I bet. It sounds easy, like sounds forms. We've been doing forms for since the internet came out, right? Why is it
right? You
still
type in
problem,
it, you hit
right?
the submit button.
Yeah,
you know,
what's the problem? But yeah, it turns out that some things that seemed or that might even be trivial to write in other languages that are not typed and also easy to get wrong, of course, might have some surprisingly complex types, right? Which is I think the case for forms as well.
Yeah, and Formless is actually a bit of an example of this, where I in retrospect, I think I went a little bit too far in trying to like type everything like exactly appropriately. And something that I learned a lot with hooks was kind of the value of sometimes, if you can do it safely, like hiding away some of that type information, so you don't have to like thread it through everywhere and make sure that everything's perfect everywhere all the time. Like I definitely was trying that with Formless, and I think hooks is a much better example of something that could end up having crazy types that through some tricks you can still safely cut that down significantly and just make a much more pleasant interface. Because the biggest problem to my mind with Formless is you get a type error and it's like 30 type class constraints and nowhere to be seen is like your actual error. So I have an announcement. I am working on a hooks version of Formless, which reduces the whole library to just one file, which will be really nice. I'm excited for that, but it's not quite ready yet.
Well, that's interesting. Looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Okay, so since you've mentioned hooks, let's just jump to hooks then, and we'll circle back to the real world after. So yeah, what's the idea behind hooks then?
Yeah, Halogen hooks.
What's your elevator pitch for that? Sorry.
Yeah, my elevator pitch. Well, one thing I mentioned at the beginning was renderless components, which is this idea that if I want to make a component reusable, one of the first things that I could do is just not render anything, like give you everything you need to do your own rendering. But the effort of trying to capture every possible way that you might want an autocomplete to render and like let you write your own CSS classes, but not the structure, just inevitably falls down like right away. Like somebody's always going to need some like, oh, I actually need this to be like embedded in this other thing or whatever. If you really want it to be as flexible as possible, one of the nicest things to do is just pull out the rendering. And that's what Formless and Select did in the first place. It's like, here's everything you need. I'm just giving you state and some actions, but you do everything else. And hooks takes that quite a bit further, because instead it's like just the logic itself, and it's kind of encapsulated away from you, and you get to write these. It's as if you get to write just functions, but they get to opt into things like state. Like I want this function to just have some state in it, but it's otherwise I can still think of it as a function. Or I want this function to be able to like fork a thread and be running some stuff behind the scene, but otherwise I want to think of it as kind of a function. And hooks lets you actually build components that way. So you write everything in hooks, and then you turn them into components if you want. But if you just want them to be a stateful function, you can do that instead. And as I'm talking about this, I realize what a bad elevator pitch that just was. There's a much better pitch for hooks.
Okay.
One of them is introducing Halogen hooks, article on my website, which walks through some motivating examples and gets into the library a bit more. But the idea originally comes from React. So React came out with a feature called React hooks. And they are just, there's such a nice model for writing components and writing this kind of logic. in a way that fits a little bit better, in my opinion, with like the functional programming way, more so than like stateful components where you're sort of imperatively doing things. It's a little bit more like flowing through a function in a way that we're more used to. So I really like hooks, and I thought Halogen should have them too. And Nathan was a enormous help in putting this together, as usual. I would say Nathan's kind of the invisible person who's involved in like each library I've put out. He's got a big hand in it. So many thanks to him.
Okay, so I've seen that. Like, what was the current version for hooks? I think it's is it still in early, like we might change everything on it, because like it was a few months ago, or has it stabilized? How do you feel about it?
I'd say it's pretty stable at this point. There's been one change to the interface. It used to be an indexed monad that basically made sure that you always ran any hooks that you used in the same order, which is really important for the internals of it. But it turns out that it was just a bit complex, and it made the type errors worse. And so I really wanted to make hooks ergonomic and performant as much as I possibly could. Learn some lessons from Formless, and so my work since then has just been like cleaning up the interface, making it as fast as I can. And so there's been one breaking change since like May, I think.
Okay.
And I don't anticipate any more to the interface. So I'd say it's pretty stable.
So the interface is now a like quote unquote simple monad rather than an index monad, or how does it work now?
Yeah, so it's always been a free monad, and just like a little bit of how hooks works under the hood is you have this is actually another thing that's really cool about Halogen. The Halogen is a free monad. And so when you do like a state update or you fork a thread or whatever, that's all running in Halogen M, which is itself a free monad. And the thing is, Halogen M gets interpreted into AF, and then that's how your application gets run. But you can also, if you want, you could get in and reinterpret it in your own pass before interpreting it to AF. So you could choose, when they modify state, maybe I'm going to log that as a debugging pass or something. So you can actually get involved with it there. But you can also write your own free monad that interprets into Halogen M, which then interprets into AF, which is what hooks does. So hooks is its own free monad that gets turned into Halogen M and then eventually into AF. So all of the like, how do you get it to actually run? That's all done by Halogen. I'm not doing anything. It's all just turning into Halogen calls. And
so it's sort of
initially
a DSL
this was
which compiles quote unquote to Halogen M, right?
Totally, yeah. So it's
cool.
You're still writing a Halogen component under the hood, but you've got this sort of DSL on top of it, and so that interprets all the way through. And previously it was an indexed free monad, and now it's just a normal free monad with like a phantom type parameter that's carrying around like what hooks you used internally. And the difference is, with the indexed one, you're taking both the state before the transition and the state after the transition, after the bind. Both of those are tracked in the type, but in this version, there's only one index. It's just, this is what the hook is, and each time you bind, you just concatenate into the hook type.
Okay.
A bit of a sort of a technical, more interior than anything else detail, but it does make things a bit simpler.
Cool, interesting. Okay, I guess I need to have another look at it, because last time I played with it, it was back when it was an index monad. So I need to look at it again and see how it works now.
Oh, that reminds me, you were part of the inspiration for this. You couldn't use pure. Like there were some like weird sort of edges that this makes nicer.
Yeah, I think I was trying to do some weird pure version, which ended up being someone's safe coerce or something, which I think kind of ended up biting me in the end.
Yeah, no longer necessary. Okay, cool. I would recommend it if you're coming back to hooks, or if it's your first time seeing hooks. Introducing Halogen hooks is good. And then the repository actually has quite a bit of documentation. And a recent addition this summer was like documentation for maintainers, and it goes through like what are the internals like? Like how do you actually understand the internals of hooks if you want to contribute or something like that? And you may find that interesting, because that talks about this quite a bit.
Okay, I mean that's quite inspiring, right? Because like a lot of projects don't even have good documentation for users, right? Whereas you actually take the time to write documentation for maintainers. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, that was Jordan Martinez ended up contributing quite a bit to hooks, and and it was just really useful to have something that explains how the inside of the library actually works. And it's something I really wish was more common across libraries in PureScript. There's so many like easy documentation wins to be had in the community, and so that's actually something I'm actively working on at the moment.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely something useful. Because a lot of the time in a language like PureScript where you don't have like there's not really like, okay, there's the beginner book for PureScript, like the PureScript book, and then there's sure the Haskell book for people who come from Haskell, but there's a distinct lack of intermediate books, right? So what if I need to understand how, I don't know, how run works, or how like something that's not a trivial library that I should understand after having read a beginner's book, right? And like a lot of people go to read the source, and sometimes maybe it's trivial, but other times you'll just find an unsafe course and be like, what? How does this actually work, right? Why does it work? Why can I use this here, right? And I always joke and say that half of Nate's libraries are just unsafe courses over nice text. But I mean, that's absolutely awesome that they work like that. But then it makes it makes it harder to understand how they actually work, right? Because that doesn't give you a lot of information if you're not used to this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's such a hard, like, I don't know, conundrum. You've got the difficulty of writing the library, the difficulty of writing documentation for it in the first place. That makes sense because you may understand your library differently as the implementer versus how a user might come to this and be like, what is it? Yeah. And so many READMEs just start with like, this is an implementation of like whatever, and you're like, I don't know what they're talking about at all. Like, what is this library? Like, what is it? And it can be really difficult to like switch into the user's shoes, and then to like add documentation for implementers on top of that. It's like it makes it so that the effort of publishing a library goes from like 1 to 15 because like so many things get layered on top. And I think it's very understandable that documentation is sparse, especially we do have types to guide us. It's not enough, but the documentation thing is so difficult. And I wish that it was not, I wish it was a solvable problem, but it seems to be a very like history of computing kind of issue.
Yeah, and also like it's not only it costs 15 to get out. Like by creating documentation, you increase the cost of every subsequent update. Because you need to keep them up to date. Because if they're not up to date, then it's worse to have them than not at all, almost, right?
Yeah.
If they're out of date or misleading or anything like that, right? So it's
so documentation as the person who creates the library is almost actively like a disincentivized thing to do. Like it's just so costly, and unless you like actually see somebody read the documentation, it's kind of like is this even helping people that much? Like, I don't know. And so there's just so many reasons not to do it that like the main thing that gets me to do it is just seeing every day people being like, how I like this library, like, how does it work over and over again? I'm like, if only you had documentation. So it's a hard problem.
Okay, so are you using the Halogen hooks at your current like in your repository at work, or is it still an experimental thing for you?
Yeah, I wish that I was, but I work at Awake Security with Nathan Fabian and Colin Wall and Avante, and we are at Themodius in Slack, and we use PureScript React, so just the very raw React bindings. And so we've got our own React hooks implementation in there, which is cool. Well, I guess it's not that similar to Halogen hooks, but it inspired me to write Halogen hooks in the first place. And so I'm using like a hooks model to write in React, which is somewhat like Halogen. So I feel like I'm sort of writing an impoverished Halogen plus hooks at work. So I sort of wish that I was, but I think there are a lot of lessons that are transferable between the two, between Halogen and React, Halogen hooks and React hooks. So I wouldn't say that Halogen hooks is too experimental per se, but I'm not able to use it at work.
Okay. Well, I bet like if anybody is using them or planning to use them, then you should definitely tell us and tell Thomas about it, because I'm sure he'd love to know if you're using it in production or planning to.
Yeah, open invitation.
Yep, hit that email button.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to real world then. So what was, I guess we kind of touch it. So but what was the like, how did that project start? I guess it was the or like how did you decide you were going to work on this?
Yeah, I left CitizenNet in the fall of 2018 to join Awake Security, and uh, I knew that I was about to be switching into writing a React application, and I just spent like a year and a half desperately trying to figure out how do you architect like a Halogen application and cribbing from Slam data and your template repository and everything. And I thought like there just really needs to be like a comprehensive, like with writing that tells you about it, not just like here's a showcase, but also like explaining how it's working, and how to build it up and how to like approach it, mindset wise. I thought that really needed to exist, and I had like 2 weeks in between jobs, and so I basically spent it on that. I wanted to make sure that this knowledge didn't, fade out for me.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted something for myself. If I get back into writing Halogen, I want to be able to refer to this. And so it just seemed like a golden opportunity, kind of too good to pass up to write it all down, as I transitioned to a non-Halogen job.
Do you also
so that
find
that was an early one.
do you also find that while you're writing this, you learn things yourself? Like, oh, I haven't wait, right? We're trying to explain things to
every time. Like, nothing makes me feel. Oh, actually, no. Other things do make me feel dumber than writing, but like writing, writing is so hard. It's like you'd mentioned the optics article and some of the other articles on the site. I mean, they take so long because it's difficult to explain, and then like every paragraph, I'm like, oh, I don't actually understand this the way that I thought I did. I've just been talking a big game. Like if I try and actually write it down right now, like it's so difficult, especially in few words to explain it. And I definitely found that with real world Halogen as well. So many like weird places too. It would be like, I'd be writing a type signature in like a separate file, and I'd be like, why am I doing this? Like, why is this going in this file? And why am I designing this solution in this way? And like explaining it is so difficult to do. And in some ways it's not even possible. I think there's some aspects of writing an application, a big application, and especially in PureScript, or maybe not especially, but in PureScript, that starts to be like very intuitive, and it might be something that like you kind of have to do it and follow along with something like real world Halogen, but you actually have to build the app. And at that point, it starts to just make sense for you without explanation. I think there are some things that really are better absorbed that way.
By example, rather by...
Yeah. By like you do it and then you're blocked and you're like, oh, I get that this isn't even possible. Like that's why they didn't do it, because it's impossible. Like or whatever it is, and you start to get like an intuition for it. I mostly hear people call that like tacit knowledge. Versus like explicit knowledge. I think it's something Matt Parsons was talking about recently. That makes it very difficult to explain some topics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And like especially explain, like maybe you could try to devise an explanation, but then it's probably not translate well to written like prose, or maybe even like not to beginners. Like you need to understand a lot of things. Like you need to be like, okay, I need like a 1 hour video to explain, well, you need to do this and then this and then this, and then you'll eventually have to do this, and then you'll get stuck, and that's why we're not doing that, right? So you kind of can't do like a short book explaining, hey, why did I do this here, right? It's kind
right.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes it's like you could get it written down, but it just like it wouldn't be the best way to teach it.
Yeah.
And you get so bogged down in it that they might just give up on the whole thing and leave, and that's kind of your worst outcome. So yeah. So yes, I'm very much with writing, learning all the time.
So how's the process? So you wrote it down in like a couple of weeks, and at least the initial version, and then you submitted it to the like real world thing, and or something like that, or how did that work? How was the process?
Yeah, it was basically like a giant pot of coffee and sort of daily building up the application. I started with that application structure. So started with like the kind of the core, app monad, reader T, ref and state, and all that stuff from CitizenNet. And yeah, it was mostly like coding. And then every time I made a decision, I tried to like write down in a comment like why I was making that decision, or explain the type a little bit. and those largely got deleted and rewritten. But I don't think it would be possible for me to write an application like this with explanation at the same time without doing the writing with, it was almost like literate programming in that sense, doing the writing along with the programming. And the first version was actually quite badly written and not very well coded either. Like the programming was not so good. So it wasn't until January, that following January, that I polished it up and published it.
Okay, cool. Let me swap scenes because we are now. I brought up the like RealWorld, like the main repository, and like Halogen is what 7th here. I mean,
my screen's pretty small, so I can't quite see. But
yeah, it seems like it's 7th, like it's here, right? Which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th, right? Which is super impressive. Like consider the alternative, like all of this, like React and Angular and Vue. That we're never going to beat.
I mean,
there's no way, right? There's just so many people behind those communities. But if you look at the relative number of stars and popularity of these repositories versus the PureScript one, it's like it feels like every person in the PureScript community clicked star here, right? Whereas here you get like. So which is to show. Well, I mean, no, thank you for working on this because this is like something like this is so good to have like in because I think there's so many people interested in hey I may be interested in PureScript, but how does it look like, right? How would an application look like, right? Before spending, because this is again something that we've talked on stream a few times with some of the other guests. Like getting consider the average JavaScript developer or whatever who's like frustrated with how with the number of bugs or whatever, they just want something better, right? And they want to try something else. But in order to see whether PureScript or Haskell is better, they need to pay a huge cost, like a huge initial cost, right? There's no easy way to I want to try a bit of PureScript, so give me like the 24-hour tutorial. I mean.
Yeah.
Right. Like PureScript in a weekend or whatever. That's going to be very, very hard. Unless you maybe knew some Haskell from college and maybe you kind of remember and you're very good at that or whatever. But it's almost never going to be the case where you can pick up a language like PureScript or Haskell within a few days or something, right? So something like this can definitely be okay. I need to get a taste of what an application looks like, and I don't want to start learning. And sure, that it might not be the language for everybody, but it's great that it exists, right?
Actually, I would really recommend. I think his name is Jonas Buntix. I might be saying that wrong. Wrote RealWorld React or PureScript React RealWorld. Which is really, really nicely done. I think it's actually quite a bit nicer internally than my repository. It came out a couple months ago. I would definitely recommend checking that one out as well for anybody who's maybe seen mine but not that one. Really, really well done.
Okay, cool. So let's see. Andy is saying, for example, React Basic DOM and React Basic Hooks have a dead link, no documentation. Starting with PureScript is kind of scary, although the library is nice and usable. I have no experience with React. Actually, I have no experience with React, period. Not with JavaScript and not with PureScript. I've just, with JavaScript, I've done some Angular, and then PureScript, I've only used Halogen ever. Never even looked at React, so I don't know.
You lucky. That's very lucky background then.
So let's see. It's such a pleasure going through the RealWorld Halogen project. I can't thank you enough, somebody in chat, some W. But it's awesome. And then Yu-Gi-Oh said Formless was scary as when I started with Halogen. We touched on that. It's
Formless is scary. I'm totally on board with that.
But Halogen is scary, right? Like to begin with, Halogen is a bit scary.
Yeah, Halogen is
used to that, like to those sort of types, right? And then Formless is a level on top of that, right?
And just to reverse a little bit, something I'd said earlier in the stream is just a little bit of a rewrite of Formless using hooks that has it's still scary type-wise, but you don't really need to look at the types so much. That makes it actually quite a bit nicer to use. But unfortunately, typing forms I would,
Oh, yeah.
I really, if anybody has like the inspiration, the desire to make their own form library, I very much encourage you to do it. And I would love to see it. If there were like a successor to Formless that were much better, that would make me very happy. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Oh yeah. So let's see. KRDVR said the functional in the real world stuff brings me hope to find joys in programming. Yep. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah, I would definitely describe my like experience programming PureScript as more joyful in general. I mean, the kinds of errors that I end up like banging my head against are actually like rewarding a lot of the time. It's like, how do I design a type that like admits the sorts of possibilities that I want? How do I design like a solution to this problem versus like, what do you mean it's undefined? What is that supposed to mean? Like, you know, and then like some problems are much less satisfying to solve than others. And I really enjoy the sorts of problems that PureScript gives you to solve.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. Oh, Paulus linked the Real World React repository. Thank you, Paulus.
Yeah, definitely check it out. It's a really cool project.
And yeah, definitely make sure you star it if you like it. It's we need to also get this project up there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's see. Oh, so then I also noticed on your website. Let me click on it, and I'll swap to the scene in a second. So the guides have like you have a guide as that seems to also have a draft. So did you never end up finishing to the degree you'd like it to be done?
Yeah, as I talk about all this documentation stuff as if I've learned something. Yeah, that's still in draft form. It's actually still on Halogen 4. Most of it's not needed to be on Halogen 5 because you actually have the source is on Halogen 5. But yeah, so this guide is like the companion to the repository that gets more into like, what's the philosophy behind the architecture? You know, what's the reason to, you know, the phrase like push effects to the edges? Like, what's that about? How do you approach designing data, that kind of thing? And a lot of the stuff in here is, it's like my understanding at that time. It really needs an update. And it's stuff that if you've been doing functional programming for a little while, you probably already know. But it's more meant for people who are like, hey, I just sort of arrived at Halogen and I'm fairly new to PureScript. I felt like the repository would still be too overwhelming, like on its own, even with the comments. And so this is meant to be like the
companion
mindset
to the
part of it.
to the comments. Okay.
Yeah. Like, how do you approach? Like, how do you even approach designing types for the things that are in this conduit application? And so this is meant to be like background knowledge, and then to actually see what I did, you go and you read the source. Cool.
That's super cool. I actually didn't even know this existed until now. So
maybe you should. I might need to make a bigger link to it because I think it is quite helpful. Depending on your level of experience, I don't think that you would necessarily need it, but for others it may be useful.
Yep. Cool. Well, so I guess we can probably move away from the halogen part, unless you have any other announcements to make other than.
No, just I'm really grateful to Halogen. It's what got me my start as a professional developer in the first place, and I'm now these days I'm a co-maintainer with Gary of the library, and so there's some really cool like ergonomics, like polishing up and simplifying types and making code a little bit less verbose in Halogen 6, which is right around the corner. So not too much in the way of breaking changes, but just like makes it nicer and more polished. Then Halogen 7, we're kind of talking about, and we're hoping to make some pretty big simplifications to those scary types.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
I've got some high hopes for the future of Halogen that I think will be really nice.
Cool. Well, yeah, so I guess we can mark the end of the Halogen section maybe, and then again, that doesn't mean we're banned from talking Halogen from now on, but
right.
So let's